Good afternoon. So, today we're looking at open economy macroeconomics. Particularly, we're going to be looking at the ISLM model. Last time we saw a little bit of the derivation of the ISLM. I'm going to finish it off today. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to relate this open economy model to the Irish economy experience. We looked a little bit about how macroeconomics is understood today, basically through something called the Lucasian synthesis, which Robert Lucas, the 1995 Nobel laureate in economics, was responsible for. We looked a little bit about how macroeconomic issues essentially define the theory and how it develops over the next 20 years. You saw that the theory of open economy macro basically comes from the 1980s, the theory of and history of globalization, really when it kicked off. We looked a little bit about price adjustment and Say's law, when it works, when it doesn't. And we also looked a little bit about the basic ISLM, where it comes from and how it's derived. ISLM, IS is investment and saving. It's the real economy. When you think about the real economy, think about a plumber. This guy driving around in a van with a pile of tools and some copper wire, copper pipe, and maybe an apprentice. When you think about the financial economy, think about an overdraft. He goes to a bank, he has to have an overdraft to pay for his tools, to pay for his equipment, and also to pay for the wages of his apprentice. Think about that, the interaction of the real and financial when you are thinking about this model. It's classical macroeconomic theory. The ISLM is a general equilibrium model. It's the kind of model that's used all over the world to try to understand what happens when different markets interact with one another. It's a general equilibrium because at a perfect level of interest, you'll have a perfect level of output. So we ran through this before as well. Output is a function of employment of the two goods. There's some amount of people N producing X. There's some amount of people N producing Y. The output is a function of how many people you use. So if you can think about plumbers, there can only be so many people plumbing and using, putting in toilets and fixing showers and all that stuff at any particular point in time. And that function has diminishing marginal productivity, meaning DFDT goes down. Okay? Prices are always equal to marginal costs, so we have a perfectly competitive system here. You've seen this before. P is equal to MC. Marginal cost increases in the labor input for each increment of output. And that gives you this. So the prices, in some sense, are the wage times the change in the number of workers. If you increase the number of workers, the price is going to go up. And that holds for the Y good as well. And then I made you write this down the last time. If you weren't here, please write it down. It's very important. For this model, income is the value of output, which is just price times quantity. This is another stripped down way of describing GDP. GDP is just the price of everything in the economy times the quantity of everything in the economy. Okay, we use a price index to deflate it, but that's what GDP is. It's the price times the quantity. Okay? And this gives you this relation. Just write down the words. Income is equal to the value of output, which is just price times quantity. And so you have that I is equal to IX plus IY, which is just the change in wages from the number of workers producing Y, plus the change in wages for the number of workers producing X. No need to write that equation down, folks. Just have a sense of what's going on. Just have a sense of what's going on. Income is equal to the value of output, which is equal to price times quantity. Again, all this stuff is available online, so you don't need to write it all down unless I tell you to. So, the quantity of money in the system is given. There's only 100 million or 200 million or 30 trillion. It's given. It comes from outside the model. It's what's called an exogenous variable. And it's a fixed relation between M and income. So there is an idea here that the only reason you're going to use money in any particular situation, the only reason that you'll use money in this situation is to affect transactions, effectively. Affect transactions. Okay? So that's something I quite like to think about anyway. So it is the fact that n is some constant k, which we call the velocity of money, times I, your income. In other words, you have a certain amount of demand for investment goods. You want investment goods, and that is a function of the interest rate. If the interest rate goes up, your demand for investment goods goes up. Makes perfect sense. If the interest rate goes down, your demand for investment goods go down. And I really quite like this idea. I really quite like this. I really quite like this idea that in some sense, the supply of savings is going to be a function of the interest rate. Now, what's the savings rate in Ireland right now? It's like 14%. And what's the interest rate on basic goods? It's about 5%. Okay? The interest rates have been coming down, not up, for the last 4 or 5 years. They've been sliding down, but savings have been driving up. So there's something else going on in the Irish economy. When you connect what's happening, there's something else going on in the Irish economy, and you should make a note of that here. It's not the case in Ireland that the supply of savings is a function of the interest rate. Or, a better way to say it is, it's not only the case that the supply of savings is a function of the interest rate. If somebody told me that I could get a 25% return on my deposits, I would absolutely go and just put all my money in my bank account and say, children, find the food yourselves. You'll be grand. Yeah? Because I can make the money that way. If I can't, if something else is holding me back, then yeah, maybe I won't do that. So higher savings always means higher investment in this stripped down model. And so we have this idea of the demand for loanable funds, if you like. So IX is the output of capital goods, some investment thing here, and I is the interest rate. So as the interest rate is high, you save, you don't invest. The lower the interest rate, the more investment you get. And we can see this as being true in the Irish case. As interest rates came down after the year 2000, what happened? People went, yay, free money! And they all ran off and built loads of buildings. One of which, by the way, you're sitting in. This is a great example of something that would not have existed in a higher interest rate regime. If interest rates were 13, 14, 15%, it wouldn't have made a return on investment. It wouldn't have made sense in terms of return on investment to build this building. But we did. And in fact, apparently, somebody was telling me we're going to have the mortgage paid on this sucker in the next 2-3 years, which is great. The business school actually has a mortgage, and you're all helping to pay it off. So thanks for that. So the supply of loans looks a bit like this. Of course, if the interest rate is very high, people will lend you money. If you have a 25% interest rate, somebody's going to lend you that money because they'll make a return, and then you get this. So this is the amount of investment, NX, in some good. This is the actual amount of investment and also employment, because remember that N is a number. It's like 1.7 million people. Yeah, that's the number of people that are employed in Ireland right now. 1.7 million. So the supply and demand of loanable funds determines the interest rate. Okay? So, this is a typical classical theory. The causal chain runs like this. And if you get this, you'll get the rest of it. If you understand this, you'll get the rest of it. Okay? Hi. You don't have to be here if you don't want to. It's just... Okay. M determines I, total output. Okay? I determines IX, which is the output of investment goods, and IX determines NX. You get a given wage W. Okay? So, I minus IX determines IY, so the output of consumption goods is the residual, and then you get this. You get a given wage. But everybody please write this down. The causal chain, if this then that, if this then that. Lower money wages means higher employment. This is a very important point. Lower money wages means higher employment. Please write it down. Okay? Lower money wage means higher level of employment. Okay? The reason that that's important is because one of the things that we have had a problem with in Ireland is wages being too high and prices being too high. Well, the Keynesian causal theory, or the Hicksian causal theory, says that lower wages mean lower prices. So should it be the case that if we lower wages, if employers lower wages, will firms lower prices? That's a clear and important problem that you guys have right now in your lives. The price of living in Ireland, in Limerick, is very expensive. Okay? So, if we don't change the money supply, actually, then you'll actually have a higher income relative to prices. So you'll end up with higher sales. Higher sales mean increased employment and a low real wage due to a diminishing marginal product. So actually, I was arguing last time that we should think about minimum wage policy. This is the classical theory. The typical classical theory of someone who believes in Say's law, the idea that supply creates its own demand and the price system allows you to adjust one thing to the other, what this is actually telling you in a certain sense is you shouldn't have minimum wages. They're a bad thing. Now, many of you actually, I think almost 90% of you, thought wages were a good thing, as a matter of fact. Many of you said, well, actually, when I asked you the last time, you said, no, we'd quite like to keep our minimum wage, which is telling me that you're maybe a little bit more advanced than the classical economists of the 19th century, which is not a bad thing. Okay. In 1936, John Maynard Keynes, then easily the most highly influential, easily the best regarded, easily the smartest economist of his generation, rocks up and he writes the General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. This is a massive kick in the teeth to the accepted classical theory that I just showed you. It says effectively the economist and the policymaker should intervene in the economy. It's not okay to allow the price system to adjust. Okay? It was very influential, but actually few economists read it in 1936. Very few economists. Okay? Most economists, even today, have never read the general theory. The reason is, and I know this because I have read it, it's a pain in the ass to read it. It's really, really, really complicated. Somebody once told me that you know a classic book because when somebody reads it, they never say they are reading it. They say they're rereading it. They say, oh, I'm rereading Keynes, as if you read it once before, you know. Most people relied on summaries and textbook interpretations. The truth about it is that the general theory is a very imprecise, it's a great book with a capital G. It's up there with, you know, the greatest books written by human beings. It's in the top kind of 100, definitely. But it's not a precise book. It's a great book because it's not precise. There's lots of room for interpretation, a bit like the Bible. And effectively, it caused a row. And what happened was, in 1937, a guy called John Hicks, who was then a very young man, wrote this work called Mr. Keynes and the Classics. And he used the ISLM model to explain Keynesian theory to everybody else. And so basically, the way this works, the way it worked was that Hicks came up with his own version of Keynesian theory and sold that as Keynesian theory. So the theory that you learned in last year as well, is not really Keynesian economics. You learned what Hicks thought about Keynesian economics. It's a bit like the Bible. You don't actually have a written down transcript of what Jesus said. You've got some dude 400 years later saying, I think what Jesus meant to say was, similarly. I'm not having a go at your religious, at anybody's religious views or anything like that. My point is quite simple. There is the economics of Keynes and there is Keynesian economics, and the two are not the same thing. Okay? So, how does this work? 1937, Hicks sets out this idea of a typical classical theory, and he steps through the argument that I've just stepped through with you there, and he argues that Keynes's innovation, Keynes's big innovation is that the demand for money should obey a marginal analysis. Okay? He says there should be some curve, right, which makes money demand and money supply equal. He assumes that the supply of money is exogenous. It comes from somewhere else. You just print off 100 million euros. Mario Draghi does it, boom, and it's there. And he says, right, there should be some amount. And I showed you this on the board on Monday, whenever it is we talked the last time. Some amount of money M, some interest rate I. Okay? And essentially what he said was, right, well, okay, if you assume that's the case, then if you increase the interest rate, well, then you'll end up with this level here. You'll end up with a higher level of investment. And this is what gives you the LM curve. And again, this is what I did with you on the board earlier on. You end up with the LM curve, which relates the amount of investment and saving in the system to the interest rate. That's the LM curve. When you think of the LM curve, okay, think about our plumber and his overdraft. Is the plumber going to go for the overdraft if the interest rate is really, really high? No, he's not. What does that mean? If he can't afford his overdraft, then he's going to fire the apprentice. So if the interest rate is too high, you'll have lots of unemployment. That's how, in a sense, that's how the LM curve connects to the IS curve. And we'll see that now in a second. So Hicks's general theory. He has, in some sense, demand is a function of investment and consumption. The savings is a function of income. Your income is a function of your saving. And you get this. Income and investment, right? It's a consumption function. Investment is a function of the interest rate. And this then gives you a sense that saving is a function of income. It looks like this. Is the top picture a realistic picture of what's happened in Ireland? Our income has gone down in the past 5 years, vastly down. Yet our savings rate has come up. So, for Ireland, at the moment, this is not a good picture. Nevertheless, we must go with this because this is how Keynes' general theory was spelt out according to Hicks. And this notion, when you add in the notion of the multiplier, gives you the investment, the IS curve, if you like. It looks like this. And it's downward sloping. What it tells you is that there'll be more output in a given system for a lower rate of interest. And that's exactly what we have seen in the pre-2007 period. And this gives us this. Now would everybody please take this diagram down? Okay? Would everybody please, this is the canonical ISLM diagram. You kind of need to know it, and I'll expect that you do know it from now on. I've shown you the derivation, where it comes from, but this is the Keynesian, or the Hicksian rather, the Hicksian interpretation of Keynes. This is where it comes from. Note two things. Number one, the LM curve slopes up at a particular point. It's going grand, I drew it as a straight line, but actually what happens is it kind of shoots up at a particular point. And this represents the fact that at very high interest rates, you're not going to get a very high increase in output. Okay? So imagine that we're here. Got some interest rate here. Okay, we're here. And we want to get a big increase in output. We want to get a big increase in output. We want to move from Y1 to Y3, Y2. Okay, we want to get to there. Well, that means basically you're going to have to move the interest rate from 15% to 30% or something. There's going to need to be a really huge change in investment, a huge change in the interest rate, rather, to allow that to happen. Okay, and even then you're probably not going to get it. That's why that's curved up like that. It represents the notion that it's very, very hard to achieve increases in real economic output at very high interest rates. In the 1980s in Ireland, excuse me, in the 1980s in Ireland, it was actually very, very difficult to get loans, and the average business loan was between 15 and 20%. So in the mid 1980s, it's much, much lower now. Okay, with interest, with inflation, the nominal, the real cost of capital was something like 23% in 1986. That's incredibly high. It's probably closer to 3% today. Okay? If you wanted to increase economic output in that situation, the best thing you could do was cut interest rates. But the government was unwilling or unable to do that at one point. So, Hicks was wrong. He said that Keynes was a marginalist, this notion that you consider infinitesimal changes in your wage, and that in some sense gives you the marginal productivity of your labor. Here is Hicks. He says, income and the rate of interest are now determined together, just as price and output are determined together in the modern theory as demand and supply. Indeed, Mr. Keynes's innovation is closely parallel in this respect to the innovation of the marginalists. What this is saying is, lads, relax. I know your man is saying that you're completely wrong, and everything that you've studied and everything that you've got your professorships at Oxford and Cambridge from is incorrect. And actually, the policies that you're promoting are contributing to the destruction of economic welfare for millions of people. So don't worry, you're still right. You're still okay. Keynes is slagging you off, but that's just rhetoric. In actuality, he's really, really close to your way of thinking. In this way was an intellectual revolution accomplished. Hicks was able to build in the major insights of Keynes by essentially misrepresenting him. Okay? It's a very important point in the history of economic thought that you should all understand and know. Essentially, Hicks is doing a sales job here. He's selling the benefits, not the features. And that's a big problem. Okay? So that's why it's called Mr. Keynes and the Classics. It's called Mr. Keynes and the Classics because he's trying to bring that together. Okay? Couple of things. Slope of the LM curve, as we've described, it's almost horizontal at very low levels of investment. And again, it's almost vertical for very high levels of investment. That's one thing where the marginalists, the classicals, the people that Keynes in 1936 were having a go at, they would say, well, yeah, no, we believe that. That's true. We know it's true because it's kind of true. Okay? So that they're saying that. However, in the middle of the LM curve, in the Keynesian region, okay, any rightward shift in the IS curve, investment and saving, by fiscal policy, for example, which the classicals were absolutely against, they said the government can't get involved in the market. They shouldn't do it. We should leave the market to itself. We shouldn't be getting involved in this, lads. And Keynes is saying, no, we actually should. So what he did was, it was very, very, very clever. He said, oh, well, he's basically the same as you guys at the edges, but in the middle, any shift in the IS curve actually boosts income. Therefore, fiscal policy is a good thing. So what you should do when the economy's in bits is get the government to spend money. In other words, Keynes is right and you are wrong. But just for this special case, just this one time, just for this moment. Okay? Could you all understand the rhetorical twist that he's done? His argument is very clever. It's very concise. And he was a brilliant man. So he was also very, very good mathematically. So he was able to justify this in a series of subsequent papers. In the classical region, where the IS curve or the LM curve is bent, the rightward shift in the IS curve by fiscal policy mainly boosts the interest rate. In other words, exactly as you were saying, lads, it won't be a good thing. Okay? The general theory, okay, of the employment is the economics of depression. So what he's saying is, when things are really, really, really bad, Keynesian economics switches on. The rest of the time, you guys are in charge and your ideas dominate. The rest of the time, classical economics works. It's the economics of full employment. Okay? And that's what gives you this LM curve, which looks a bit like this, and an IS curve, which looks a bit like this. Okay? So would you all please write this one down as well? And hopefully you'll see the difference between the IS curve that maybe Keynes would have drawn and the LM curve as Hicks drew it in his piece. So there are regions to this. The first point here is this is the Keynesian region. This is the Keynesian region, where the LM curve is pretty flat, where you do actually get a fairly big bump in income, a fairly big bump in investment and in saving and economic output for a corresponding increase in the interest rate. In other words, activist monetary policy is a good thing, the type of thing that Mario Draghi is doing right now. Okay? Okay. Up here, we have the classical region. Now, in this particular classical region, the LM curve is so steep that monetary policy is useless and fiscal policy is useless as well. The only thing you get up here, okay, the only thing you get up here at all is just more inflation. You don't get a big bump in a big bump in employment. You don't get a big bump in anything essentially, but inflation. Yeah, because if you increase the interest rate and you don't get a big increase in economic output, all you've done is increase the cost of capital. And what will that affect? Inflation. Okay. This is fine. And it's grand and it's all very interesting, Stephen. Or maybe it's not. But it doesn't really tell us much about Ireland. The truth about it is, in the 1930s when Keynes was writing, there was really very little trade. Trade as a percentage of the UK economy, which was then the biggest economy in the world, was only about 15%. Okay? Trade, the exports as a percentage of GDP in the US, even today, is only about 15%. They make most of the stuff that they consume in America. So Keynes's model, in a sense, is a model of a large, relatively closed economy. This won't work for us. Okay? It won't work for us because we're a small, open economy. It also won't work for even an economy like the UK or the Eurozone either. So what we need to do is we need to introduce a trade balance into this system. And so here's how you do it. A trade balance. Would everybody please just write down the first one there? If you understand the first one, then the rest of it kind of falls out, right? There's a thing called the trade balance. And essentially it says either when you trade with the rest of the world, either you're in a deficit or a surplus. You're in a deficit if your imports are greater than your exports. Okay? Your net exports are negative. Your net exports are negative. Can anybody give me an example of a country whose net exports are negative? Who imports more than they export? No. We export way more than we import. US, pretty good, pretty good. They've got a big trade deficit. Anywhere else? What about the Eurozone? Yeah, I'll show you some statistics on the Eurozone in a minute. Okay, if you understand what a trade deficit is, it means you import more than you export. Ireland normally has positive net exports. In other words, we sell to the world more than we buy. Okay? We sell to the world more than we buy. In a balanced world, the trade net exports are zero. This is almost never the case. So, the balance of payments. This is a very important concept. It's a record of all the transactions between residents of one country and residents of another. It is made up of three parts. It's very important to understand this. The current account, okay, this comprises the visibles. So it's trade in goods, and the invisibles, trade in services, and net external investment income. Okay? So in other words, the current account is stuff that you sell plus services that you sell or you bring in. If you borrow lots and lots of money from abroad, your current account will be negative. You can still be selling bucket loads of stuff to the world, bucket loads of Viagra and computer chips and whatever. But if you're importing loads of capital, you will have a negative current account. The second part of the balance of payments is called the capital account. This is international transactions in assets. Okay? International transactions in assets, physical and financial. And finally, there's something called official financing. This is intervention in the foreign exchange market. We don't do this anymore because we don't have our own currency. So you can say that there is something called a balance of payments identity. And would everybody please write that down? The current account plus the capital account plus official financing is always equal to 0. That's why you get those 3 equals. It's always equal to 0. Meaning if you have a hugely negative current account, you have a hugely positive capital account. Okay? And if you have a hugely positive capital account, you must have a negative current account. Yeah, okay. Very good. Now, CA plus KA plus OF equals 0. Always equals 0. Always, always, always. Now, before you start going, is it possible for me to self-combust with boredom? It's really important to understand this because even though this has been a fairly algebraic sort of technical lecture, the reason that you need to understand this is because this is the key to national prosperity. Exports and imports are the key to national prosperity. Sean Lemass understood this in the 1950s. For the foreign students, Sean Lemass was one of our previous prime ministers. Before he took office, Ireland was dependent almost entirely on domestic production. Lemass said, no, we're going to open up to the world. Okay? He was the first, I think he was the first Irish prime minister on the cover of Time magazine. Our current prime minister, Enda Kenny, is also on the cover of Time. When Lemass was on the cover of Time, he looked a bit like, he had kind of a funny looking beard, moustache and stuff. But behind him, they had a portrait, and behind him were 2 leprechauns dancing. It was the most offensive thing. It was really, it was really kind of a subtle jab. But at that time, that's what people thought. Anyway, so the net exports and net capital outflow are closely connected. For an economy as a whole, the net capital outflow must balance net exports. Every transaction that affects one side must affect the other. Now, don't worry, folks. I know we're marching through Mordor here, but I will take you back to the Shire. Relax. I know. It's all a bit heavy for this time of the day, but don't worry. It's important. I wouldn't make you do it unless I thought it was important. So, it is a fact. The savings rate in Ireland is given by the level of investment plus net capital outflow. You all understand net exports as a component of GDP. Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Or NX, as I've written it here. And national saving is the income of the nation, left after paying for current consumption. So S is equal to Y minus C minus G, which is equal to I plus NX. And because we know that NX is equal to NCO, S is equal to I plus NCO. National saving is equal to investment plus net capital outflow. This explains why our investment rate is so low. Our investment rate is tiny. What's happening to our net capital outflow? Is money coming into our economy or going out? What do you think? It's coming in or going out? Hands up who thinks money's coming in. Out? It's out. So that's negative. That's negative. And this must be a bit positive. So, there's something called the private balance of payments. If that's in deficit, in other words, money's flowing out of the economy, it means that the current account plus the capital account is negative. This implies the supply of currency is greater than the demand for currency, and that means if you've got a flexible exchange rate, your currency will depreciate until this equality holds. What this means is you have a way to correct for imbalances within your system. That's what this is telling you. If money's flowing out of your economy, okay, money's flowing out of your economy, then that means your supply of currency is greater than its demand, and your exchange rate will depreciate. It will actually stop this. What's the one thing we don't have in Ireland? We don't have an exchange rate. The natural lever that would have stopped the crisis from building up was no longer there. Effectively, it was turned off. And the rest of it kind of blew up on us. So, with a fixed exchange rate, a country has to buy up an excess supply of its currency. And this implies the following. If it is the case that y is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus m, then you also have to consider the exchange rate, E. If you assume flexible exchange rates, and for the European Union as a whole, of course, there are flexible exchange rates. We're just a region in there, the same way California doesn't have its own exchange rate. The current account surplus is always equal to the capital account deficit, and we have this. Current account is always exports minus imports. Exports are exogenous. Why are exports exogenous? We can't control how many people want to buy Viagra. Or we can't control how many people want to buy Aran sweaters in Sudan. We just don't know the answer. Okay? But we know that exports are exogenous, and we know that imports increase abroad as their income increases. Are international incomes increasing or decreasing at the moment? Is the world getting richer or poorer? Poorer. Most places that buy lots of our stuff, like the US, Europe, the Middle East, they're not getting any richer. Okay? So our exports are not going to increase, and our imports, they increase as income increases. What's happening to our incomes? Anybody feel rich? No, I know I don't. Private capital account. The capital account is inflows minus outflows. So what's been happening? Your inflows will increase as the capital, as interest rates increase. This is really important. The higher the interest rate is domestically, the more money will get into the system. Okay? And of course, to be in a balance of payments equilibrium, your interest rate has to increase with your income. So any deficit in the current account is offset with the capital account surplus. Grand. That's fine and all well and good. What does any of this mean, folks? I know this is a little bit technical, but what does any of this mean? What this means is, for a small open economy, the focus has to be on export-led growth. Would everybody please write that down? For a small open economy, the focus has to be on export-led growth. And the reason that it has to focus on export-led growth is the size of the domestic sector is too small. We must focus on export-led growth. If that is the primary policy instrument of the economy, if you must focus on export-led growth as opposed to anything else, you could focus on loads of different things. Then it implies you have to keep relative wage costs low. It implies competitiveness in terms of regulatory structures, in terms of taxation systems, and most importantly, in terms of wages. This relentless drive for increased productivity and lower wages means that things like universal healthcare systems become serious liabilities to the system. You cannot afford high taxes on your workers to pay for high levels of public service if your workers don't earn enough to support those services. Okay? It's important to understand this. There's a point I made this week in the Indo. The point is, if you live in an era of globalization, trying to have a welfare state of a certain size is actually very difficult. Okay? And you can see that the current administration is really fighting with this. They're fighting with this problem. Here, from 98 to 2010, is Ireland's current account balance. You can see what's happening. Okay? You can see what's happening. This blue line is merchandise. So this is us buying stuff from abroad. It's positive. Okay? Or sorry, we're selling stuff to the world. It's positive. This red line is negative. Services. We're sucking money out of the economy. And this thing here is negative. Income's going away. And so what you end up with is this vast decrease in our current account. And I'll show you another picture now, just to bring out the point. It's now about zero. Here's what our current account looks like. It was positive for most of the 90s. In other words, we were selling stuff to the world. Then it went vastly negative. It went vastly negative in 2004 as we started borrowing shed loads of cash from the rest of the world to fund our housing boom. What this chart tells you, ladies and gentlemen, is that you should focus almost exclusively on current account and capital account imbalances if you are to understand the nature of Irish economic growth. And not just Ireland. Any small economy would do. Every small economy must make it a policy prescription built in to the fabric of the government that the only thing that really matters is that we try at all times to maintain a current account surplus. If we do that, then when things go wrong, we will have money to spend to make things better. Okay? So beware. And on this I'll finish. Beware. Oh no, I won't, 'cause I've got 5 more minutes. Chill. Contrary to the general perception, there's this notion that a current account deficit is a bad thing and a surplus is a good thing. This is not the case. This is not true. And you shouldn't believe that it is true. The truth about it is, if there are only two countries in the economy, one of them has to be in surplus and the other one has to be in deficit. So it is not of necessity a bad thing. But, if the United States, for example, has a current account deficit, it may be the case that the United States is importing capital. And there's nothing wrong with that, per se. Okay? There's nothing wrong with that at all. Question, isn't too low interest rate cause inflation? No, unless, well, let's think about that for a second. How would it, if the interest rate was very low, then people would start having capital projects and they would start building big buildings like this, which would give builders money. The builders would go off and either buy houses or eat food and all that sort of stuff, and they would have a positive multiplier effect on the economy. If the employment rate was really high, if it was like 99% employment, then you're right. A low interest rate would lead to high inflation because the scarce labour market would force prices up as employers saw people coming in saying, buy my stuff, buy my stuff, buy my stuff. They just jack up the price level. So that might be the case, but most of the time, you keep interest rates low because you're not worried about inflation. In fact, you're worried about unemployment. So good question. Thank you very much for that. I was kind of worried because I hadn't had a text message all day. I was presuming somebody would be like, oh, boobies, or something, you know. But no, that's not what we got. Okay. Right. On this we will finish, ladies and gentlemen. Chill out. Just one more slide and then we're done. Imagine for a second that the balance of payments, I'm going to get you to draw something, so keep your stuff out. Imagine for a second that we're in balance of payments equilibrium. That is, we import 100 units of a good at €1 and we export 100 units of a good at €0. Okay? This BP line, balance of payments line, will show combinations of gross national product and the interest rate for which the balance of payment is equal to 0. It may slope upwards because of an increase in the interest rate and in GNP have opposite effects on the balance of payments, or it may give us a sense of what the rest of the system looks like. So would everybody please take this down? Take this down. And what we're going to do at the very start of the next lecture on Monday is we're going to manipulate the BP line and see what happens in a small open economy when you try to spend a load of money. Okay? That's what we're going to see. We're going to see an application to fiscal policy, spending buckets of cash, and monetary policy, spending a lot less. Okay. So everybody please take that down and have a sense of what is going on in this model. And check out the readings as well, they're very good. I've also linked to the Hicks paper too. Thank you very much for your time, ladies and gentlemen.